So today, 3 things that I'm going to go over with you guys that I'm going to review from you guys from Q2. The first thing that we're going to review is the supply and demand model of economics. The second thing that we're going to review is going to be the production possibilities curve, or the PPC, because that's something that comes up in units 6 and 7 as well. And then the last thing we're going to look at today is what are our goals and how do we measure the economy. So basically, we're going to review some stuff from units 2, 3, and 4. And then next week on Thursday, it's going to be all review of aggregate supply, aggregate demand, because that's the main model that we use in units 6, 7, and 8. So you need to make sure we review that one really well. So today, we're going to start with supply and demand. So let me grab a marker. Remember that in econ, we use these models to try to represent what we see in the real world. So the idea here is that we can take some with supply and demand, for instance, right? Maybe, I don't know if you guys have your driver's licenses or not, but maybe one of the things that you've noticed is in the last few months, the price of gasoline has started to go up. And it's actually a lot higher now than it was a year ago. So yeah, Samantha.
Isn't our gas still going up, and it's supposed to get to $8 or something like that per gallon because of that ship thing?
Yeah, so we had the boat that was stuck in the Suez Canal, and so that's going to affect the price of gas for sure. The reality is in the United States, most of the oil that we make into gas doesn't come from the Middle East. Most of the oil that we make into gas comes from the United States. So that ship being stuck is going to affect us some, but probably not as much as others, but again, there is, we can use supply and demand to show what's happening, right? So remember, we start with our X and Y axes with supply and demand, right? Remember, one goes in the sky, one goes in the dirt. Which one goes where?
Demand in the dirt and supply goes up.
Yeah, demand in the dirt and supply in the sky. So we label our demand, we label our supply, and then we want to label our axes. So we've got price and we've got quantity. And remember that what we're doing right here is we're just trying to show what's happening in a real world, in a market. So this is the market for gasoline. So it's what's been happening, right? So on the one hand, we have, well, before I guess we show what's happening, what do we call this point right here where they intersect? What's that special point called?
An equilibrium?
That's called our equilibrium. And in econ, equilibrium means that things are balanced. In this case, at this point right here, supply is balanced with demand. Anytime where our lines intersect, we're going to call that an equilibrium, right? And so you're going to see that in macroeconomics. We're going to talk about equilibriums. Here, this tells me my equilibrium price and my equilibrium quantity. So what that means is for this market right here, there's people who are willing to produce gasoline. And the higher the price gets for gasoline, more people start producing it. So one of the things that we'll see is if the price of gas continues to go up, some oil fields in places like North Dakota or in Canada, some oil fields where it hasn't been profitable for a few years to make gas, so they stopped drilling for oil. What's going to happen is they're going to start drilling for more oil in those places, because as the price goes up, more people are going to be willing to produce it. So a certain amount of oil is produced, and then people want to buy a certain amount as well. And so that's the demand for something, how much people want it. So what have we seen happen in the last few months? Well, we've seen a couple of things happen. The first thing that we've seen is that in the last couple of months, a lot more things have started opening up in our economy, right? So we've seen like more people have been going back to work, more kids have been going back to school, more people have been going out shopping, they've been going out to eat, they're going to stores more. So as more people get the vaccine, more people start going out into society more. Well, as we start going out more, we're going to have to drive, right? And if we're driving, that means that we want gasoline. So one of the big things we've seen since January is we've seen a big increase in demand for gas. Because as more and more states open up, and as more and more, like, you know, San Diego's now in the red tier instead of the purple. So now we can go to movie theaters. Now we can eat in restaurants. Now we could go to Padre games. Now we can go to SeaWorld. So like things that were closed are now opening up. More people want to go. They have to drive to get there. So that means more demand for gasoline. So the demand for gasoline is going up, right? That's causing our price to increase, and it's causing the quantity to that people are actually buying is going up. Now, on this, like, you know, what is it that I want you guys to, you know, remember about this? Well, there's a few things that we went over in this model that are going to be translating all throughout this quarter, at least the first half of this quarter. Yeah, Samantha.
Isn't it this model where we can only like move one, like technically line? So like you can only move demand and not move like supply, or you can only move supply and not demand?
If we do move both of them, then it gets a little bit more complicated. So like if we wanted to show what was happening with that boat that was stuck in the canal, in the Suez Canal, we could decrease supply. And so like now what's happened is we've had this like weird double shift, and my price has gone up even more. But my quantity, we're not real sure. Remember, like you can know one or the other, but you can't know both when there's a double shift. So, but I'm not too worried about you remembering the double shift, because that's a little bit more complicated than we're gonna need to get when we go forward in econ. But the things that I do need you to remember is that when we increase to the right. When we decrease to the left. So like increase right, decrease left, that's going to be the same in macroeconomics all quarter. So increase to the right, decrease to the left. In general, supply goes in the sky, demand goes down in the dirt. In general, when lines intersect, we call that an equilibrium. Usually we have some form of price on the y-axis, and we have some form of quantity on the x-axis. Those are the things that are going to translate all, you know, as we keep going this quarter. That kind of like, that's what I wanted you to remember. So that's supply and demand. Supply, how much people are willing to produce. Demand, how much people want stuff. That general definition of demand and supply, it's going to continue throughout, you know, units 6, 7, and 8. Whether we're talking about like loans, the supply of loans is how much people are willing to loan out. The demand for loans is how much people want to borrow of loans. So that's like whether we're talking about the loans graph or the money market, or eventually when we talk about you know, in unit 8, when we talk about like trading currencies and like what happens if I want to go on vacation to Japan and I need to, you know, trade in some of my dollars to get yen, there's still going to be supply and demand, and supply is going to be like people that are willing to trade, you know, yen, and demand is going to be people who want to trade for yen. So supply and demand is always going to have this kind of same meaning Demand, how much people want something. Supply, how much people are willing to produce of that thing. And then where they intersect is our equilibrium. Yeah, Samantha.
Stupid question, because like this is completely off topic, but with like exchanging money and stuff, can't you do that at airports or something like that?
You can do it online. You could do it at airports. You could do it at the border. They have like little businesses that will exchange it. And they even have currency exchanges in some places like shopping malls. So like, I'm pretty sure that Mission Valley, I haven't been there in a while, but I'm pretty sure that Mission Valley has a little kiosk by the movie theater that maybe next time you're at Mission Valley, you'll see it. There's like a little kiosk and they'll trade currencies there. So like you can exchange, you know, yen and dollars and pesos and whatever. But all right, so that's our supply and demand model. I'm not going to go over it anymore. Like we're not going to get into the shifters, for instance, because that's not really going to matter for us this semester, the shifters. It's more the idea of when we do shift, we increase to the right, we decrease to the left. When our lines intersect, we call it an equilibrium. When there is a shift, we find the new equilibrium. All of those skills are things that we're going to be using all, you know, for the next 5 or 6 weeks. So that's the first thing I want to review with you. All right, second topic for review. The production possibilities curve or the production possibilities frontier. This is another idea from microeconomics that translates to macroeconomics. So like in micro, professors make a PPC and it will be for like 2 different things. So like in this model, the idea is we've got quantity and quantity, and it's 2 different things that we could produce, right? So it's like, all right, well, we can make shoes, or we can make dresses, right? And as we use our resources, we can take those resources and we could produce dresses, or we could produce shoes, or we can choose to produce like a combination of them. Maybe we want mostly shoes and a few dresses. Maybe we want mostly dresses and just a few shoes. This line represents the different choices that we have. So we could have all shoes, we could have all dresses, we could have 50% dresses, 50% shoes. We could have almost all dresses, but just a little bit of shoes. We could have almost all shoes, but just a little bit of dresses. Those are all the different combinations of what we can make with our resources. Now, the most important idea of this model for us, when we take this thing to macroeconomics, is that this line represents an amount of production that we should get when we use all of our resources. It doesn't really matter if you're this point, or if you're this point, or if you're this point, or if you're this point. That doesn't really matter. What matters in macroeconomics is like, are we on the line, or are we on the inside of the line, or are we on the outside of the line? That's what really matters in macroeconomics. Because in macro, instead of shoes and dresses, this is going to be like consumer goods and capital goods. You might see something that would be like public and private. Public means that it's like owned by everybody. So like this would be like government, like spending on the government. Private would be like stuff that's owned by individuals. This would be like spending by like people. But the idea is like everything falls into these 2 categories. So now my PPC represents everything. Everything, if it's not a consumer good, then it's a capital good. If it's not a capital good, it's a consumer good. If it's not made for the government, it's made for people. If it's not made for people, it's made for the government. So like everything falls into those two categories. So now my PPC represents the production of everything. This point right here would be like an underproduction. That's really bad for our economy. If we're using our resources, but we're underproducing, that means that we're wasting some of our resources. We're not being efficient. If we're out here, that means that we're overproducing, that we're trying to do more than we're capable of, and it's going to end up hurting us eventually in the long run. Yeah, Samantha.
Don't you like if you overproduce, won't the product just turn out bad in a way? Because you're using the same amount of like materials. And so like if you overproduce, it means you have to like cut out something. So if you're making dresses, it's like, oh, you're cutting out maybe like 2 more inches of the dress or like something like that.
It could mean that, but usually in econ, the main resource that we're looking at like is labor. And so what it usually means if you're producing out here, what that means is like you're trying to get your dress workers to work like 12 hours a day, or you're trying to hire more people to work as dressmakers and you're having a hard time finding them. Like that's what happens out here. So usually we assume that the quality of what's being produced doesn't change, but the resource that allows us to get out here is labor. So what we try to do is we're trying to like squeeze more production out of our labor. Does that make sense? And so like we can do that for short periods of time. Like we could be like, hey, Mr. Worker, why don't you stay for a couple extra hours and we'll pay you some extra money? And it works in the short run, but eventually what happens is people are like, dude, I can go get a job over there and they'll pay me more because they're desperate for labor as well. And so what happens out here is you have a shortage of labor and eventually that causes prices to go up, what we call inflation. That's the real downside. Ashley, go ahead. And then Samantha, you're next.
Okay, so would this only be towards like clothing, or would like the overproducing count as like food and stuff, like when restaurants throw food away and stuff?
This would be, so like when we're talking about the overproducing, at this point, like we're thinking of this curve representing everything we produce in our economy. So it would be like, don't think of the overproduction as being like wasted food. Think of the overproduction being like, we're trying to produce more food than we really have enough workers to do. It's really a shortage of workers that's happening out here. That's what so like, it doesn't feel wasteful. It feels really exciting when it's happening. Because when we're out here, we're producing more stuff than we normally can. So it's like, it feels like we have excess. But at the same time, as a worker, it feels like we're always working. And people start to get like burned out and they start saying like, you better pay me more for all the work that I'm doing. And that's when prices start to go up. Samantha, you had a question?
So couldn't you use our yearbook staff here at school as well? Because like we have 3 more weeks until the yearbook is completely turned in and stuff. And so like we have a good 8-9 people here that are constantly going to sporting events, like constantly pushing the extra mile, and we still have like kids on the staff at home doing nothing. Couldn't you try and use that as a PPC graph?
Exactly. I mean, you can say, right, like for PPC graph, like what you're talking about, we could do like schoolwork and yearbook, right? And like you guys have to balance between like doing your schoolwork, you have to balance between doing stuff for the yearbook, and maybe like right now you're like almost all your effort is going to yearbook and a little bit of school, or maybe most of your effort's going to school and a little bit of yearbook, but there's like a combination of those. And then like maybe You guys are trying to do more than you're really capable of. So you're like working like 8 hours a day on the yearbook, and then you're also putting in hours a day into school, and like you're starting to feel kind of run down, and you're starting to feel kind of burned out, and you're feeling like it's just too much. That would be like out here, right? So like what's going to happen? Eventually you're going to crash, right? That same thing with our economy. When our economy is out here, it's like we're trying to do more than we just really have the resources to do. And like we're producing a lot, so we feel wealthy and like it feels good. But pretty soon people are burned out and they start saying, we want to be paid more for what we're doing. And when prices start to go up, the whole thing is going to come collapsing back down. So that's our PPC.
So like
Mhm.
when we had like our world wars and everything like that, weren't we overproducing or were we like underproducing?
So in like historically, like during the Civil War and World War I and World War II, what happened during all of those wars is that our production went way up during the war because it was like there was so much demand for everything that we had like, I mean, like during World War II, we had to limit people on their like how much sugar they could get, how much flour they could get per month, because we were just producing everything we could and we were using it all. And then when the war ended, guess what happened? It comes crashing back down because that demand is just, it can't be sustained. So nowadays with like the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war, it doesn't seem to have the same effect on our economy where it drives it up and then it causes it to kind of come crashing back down after the war is over. That was seemed like it was more of an effect in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Civil War for sure. That definitely in the past, it seemed to have a bigger effect than it does now. All right. So this is our PPC, right? Our model that shows the dot shows what we're currently producing. The line shows our goal. So we want our dot to be as close to that line as we can get it, because that line is our full employment. It's producing as much as we should with our resources. If we're on the inside of the curve, then that means we're underproducing. If we're on the outside of the curve, that means that we're overproducing, right? So we want to try to get it right. You know, we want it to be as close as we can. So how do we know? How do we know if we're on the inside or if we're on the outside or if we're right on the curve? How do we know? Well, that's what Unit 4 was all about. So for Unit, you know, the last thing we're going to look at today is like, how do we measure this? So like, how do we measure this so that we know what's happening in our economy? Well, before we measure this, we need to look at our, I'm actually gonna, all right. So the first thing is, before we can measure the economy, we have to know what it is that we're going to try to measure, and that's our goals. So every economy has 3 goals. That's a little hard to see. It ended up being right in the glare, didn't it? It just says the word goals on there if you're having a hard time reading that. So every economy has 3 goals. Number 1, the first goal is that we want our economy to grow. Because when our economy grows, right? When our economy grows, it shows us the more it grows, the more stuff we have to share amongst us all. Now, a lot of times people think like economics is all about greed and like that, like, you know, you should make as much money as you can, or it's about acquiring as much stuff as you can. That's That's not really what economics is about. Economics is about us trying to decide as a society who gets what, because we all want stuff, right? Now, maybe like what you want is like, maybe you want some like Blu-ray discs of your favorite anime, right? Maybe what you want is you're like, no, I don't really care about anime, but like I would like to get some new outfits for when I start college in the fall. Or maybe what you care about is like playing a sport and you're just like, yeah, I would like to get a better tennis racket or baseball bat or a better softball glove that's going to help me to play better. Maybe what you want is you're just like, I really would like a nice car. Like maybe you have a car that breaks down all the time and you're like, I would just like a car that doesn't break down, that I could rely on. Or maybe you don't have a car and you're like, I don't care if it breaks down. I just want a car. That would be great. Or maybe you're like, yeah, I have a reliable car, but I would like something that was a little nicer. The idea is that we all have stuff that we want. And so how do we figure out who gets what? Well, one thing that makes that job a lot easier is if we have more stuff to share, if our economy is bigger, if we are producing more, then we don't have to make as many tough choices, right? That if it's like, if we're trying to figure out like, if everybody has a house and we're trying to figure out like who gets a vacation home, that's better than like trying to figure out which people get shelter and which people don't get shelter. Like we would rather have like everybody have a house, and figuring out who gets a second house is better than trying to figure out like who has to be homeless and who doesn't. So the more stuff we have to share, the easier it should be for us to figure out who gets what, or at least the decisions that we're making aren't as life and death decisions, right? It's better to figure out like who gets the second, helping of food rather than trying to figure out who gets food and who doesn't get food, right? It'd be better to figure out like who gets seconds versus who doesn't. The more we produce, then the decisions that we make should be a little bit easier. So our first goal is we want to grow the economy so we have more stuff to share. Our second goal is we want prices to be stable. So that like in general, we don't want like the price of stuff going like, way up or like way down. In general, we would like our prices to kind of stay where they are as much as possible. So like we don't want like, food that cost like $5 last year to cost $10 this year and $20 next year. We want our prices to try to be pretty stable so that like, if you bought a meal for $5 last year, you should be able to get it for pretty close to $5 this year. Things like healthcare or college or going, buying gas. We want those things to try to stay as stable as they can. So that's our second goal. And then our third goal is that we want to limit unemployment. So that we want people who like want to have a job, we want them to be able to work. We want the people we want to limit the number of people who are trying to find work but can't. Samantha, go ahead. You have a question?
Okay, I keep getting kicked out and like having to rejoin again. Is it okay if I finish this Zoom meeting at my house?
Sure.
Like watch the recording of it?
That's fine.
Okay, have a great day.
All right, see you, Samantha. So these are our three goals. We want the economy to grow, we want prices to remain stable, and we want people to be able to work if they want to work. Now, we need, in order to know like how we're doing on these things, we have to have a way to measure them. So in Unit 4, we went over the ways that we measure these things. This quarter, I'm not going to make you calculate any of these things. You're not going to have to calculate how we do these measures, but you need to know what they mean, right? So the first one, if I want to measure if my economy is growing, right? How do I measure if my economy is growing? Well, the first thing that we're going to use to measure whether our economy is growing is we're going to use our real GDP growth rate. So I want to know, is real GDP growing or is it not? That's what's going to tell me about, basically whether my economy is growing or not, is that real GDP growth rate. The second thing we're going to use to measure our second goal, whether prices are stable, and also remember that the real in real GDP means that it's been adjusted for inflation. The second thing that I want to measure is whether my prices are stable. And to measure if prices are stable, we're going to use the inflation rate. So that if our inflation rate is going up, then that's going to tell us that prices are going up. And remember that like the main way that we measure inflation is we use the consumer price index or the GDP deflator. Those are the two main indexes that we use to measure this. But again, you're not going to have to calculate it this quarter, but you need to know. So like if I tell you that inflation rate is going up, that tells you that prices are going up. Or if I tell you the inflation rate's going down, that's telling you that prices are going down. So in order to know what's happening in the economy, we got to look at the growth rate. We got to look at the inflation rate. And then the last thing that we're going to look at is our unemployment rate. When our unemployment rate goes up, that means that there's more workers who are like looking for a job and can't find one. When our unemployment rate goes down, that tells us that more workers are able to find jobs than they were before. So our unemployment rate tells us what's happening with the amount of unemployment in the economy. So these are the three main things that we're going to use to figure out what's going on in our economy. Depending on what those three things tell us, we can get three different possible answers as to what's happening in our economy. So remember, actually, I'm going to use green here. All right. So we've got three possible things that can be happening in our economy. The first one is that based on these measures right here, we might look at those and we might decide, you know what, our economy is too cold. You guys remember Goldilocks, right? And that our economy can be too hot, too cold, or just right. When it's too cold, right, that means that my real GDP growth rate is low. My unemployment rate will be high when it's too cold. And usually my inflation rate is low as well. Not always, but usually my inflation rate is low as well. So we call this a recession. Or I'll call it a recessionary gap. So remember that the recession means that the economy is too cold. The second possibility is that we could have an inflationary gap. And that with our inflationary gap, our economy is too hot. That this means that we're trying to produce more than we're capable of. This is the dot on the outside of the PPC. This is us trying to make more shoes and dresses than we actually have the resources to do. So we're going to start burning out our workers. That's the inflationary gap, the economy being too hot. Recessionary gap, our economy is too cold. And then the third possibility is what we call full employment. And that full employment is when the economy is just right, where we're producing the amount that we should be producing with our resources.